Welcome to another episode of MindFeed. For today's episode, we are going to discuss the different methods of philosophizing. But before you proceed, here is our task for today's episode. With the help of Venn diagram, you are going to determine the similarities and differences of opinion and truth. But before we proceed, here is the question. What is philosophizing? Philosophizing means to think or express oneself in a philosophical manner. It also considers or discusses a matter from a philosophical standpoint. To understand fully what philosophizing is all about, here are some of its methods. First is phenomenology, which deals with person's consciousness. Next is existentialism, that truth is based in exercising choices and personal freedom. The third one is postmodernism, which accepts that truth is not absolute. And lastly is we have logic, the truth is based on reasoning and critical thinking. And now, let's discuss the first method of philosophizing, which is phenomenology. Phenomenology focuses on careful inspection and description of phenomena or appearance, defined as any object of conscious experience, that is, that which we are conscious of. Phenomenology is also a scientific study of the essential structures of consciousness. Consciousness is intentional due to every act of consciousness is directed at some object or another, possibly a material object of an ideal. Mathematics, for instance. Phenomenologists can distinguish and describe the nature of intentional acts of consciousness and the intentional objects of consciousness, which are defined through the content of consciousness. The father of phenomenology is no other than Edmund Husserl. In his book Logical Investigations, Husserl argued against psychologism, the thesis that truth is dependent on the peculiarities of the human mind, and that philosophy is reducible to psychology. In other words, it was an argument against the very thesis that he himself had argued in his first book on the philosophy of arithmetic. His continuing effort was dedicated to developing a method for finding and guaranteeing the truth, which leads to phenomenology. To understand phenomenology even more, let's define first the word phenomenon. In its etymology, phenomenon was derived from the Greek word phenomenon, which defines appearance. German philosopher Immanuel Kant used the same word to refer to the world of our experience. Kant emphasizes that once we gain experience, phenomenology is essential. Husserl intends a similar meaning except for the crucial fact that for him, it does not imply a contrast between the appearance and some underlying reality, between the phenomenon and anomenon or thing in itself. It is where trouble starts, when one supposes that what one experiences is not or not might be the truth. The most relevant example is, things will never be proven if there are no evidences. As what Edmund Husserl says, consciousness is always a consciousness of something. To understand more of phenomenology, here are Husserl's phenomenological reductions. Number 1 is the epoche of suspension, the general introduction in pure phenomenology. And secondly, eliminates the merely empirical contents of consciousness and focuses instead of the essential features, the meanings of consciousness, which points out the phenomenologist's interests. And now, let's proceed to the second method of philosophizing, which is existentialism. What is existentialism? Existentialism is not exactly a philosophical method, but a set of doctrines, but more of an outlook or attitude supported by diverse doctrines centered on certain common themes. These themes include the human condition of the relation of the individual to the world, the human response to that condition, B. especially the difference between the being of person, existence, and the being of other kinds of things. Human freedom. The significance and unavoidability of choice and decision in the absence of certainty. And lastly, the concreteness and subjectivity of life as lived, against abstractions and false objectifications. Human freedom and making choices and decisions are the main focus of existentialism. Existentialists share a concern for the individual and personal responsibility. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "We are our choices." Sartre clearly implies that making choices and achieving freedom is up to us no matter what we choose and how we conclude on the choices that we make. First existentialist Soren Kierkegaard emphasizes the authentic self was personally chosen self as opposed to public or earned identity. On the other hand, Friedrich Nietzsche is more on the opposition of the genuine individual versus public earned identity. The standpoints of both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche deals with the opposition once we deal with such choices and decisions. Jean-Paul Sartre have employed phenomenological methods to arrive at or support their specific variations on existential themes. He also emphasizes the importance of free individual choice, regardless of the power of other people to influence and coerce our beliefs, desires, and decisions. Sartre argued that consciousness or being for itself is such that it is always free to choose, though not free not to choose, and free to negate the given features of the world. Good faith or authenticity is considered to be one of the problems of Jean-Paul Sartre because it might came to horror of war and occupation. St. Augustine was concerned with the spiritual nature of the true self as opposed to the inauthentic demands of desire and the body. On the part of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he was adamant about the essential goodness of the natural self in contrast to the corruption imposed by society. And here are some of the other existentialists. We have Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, and Gabriel Marcel. And now, let's go to postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Postmodernism has come into vogue as the name for a rather diffuse family of ideas and trends that in significant respect rejects, challenges, or aims to supersede modernity. The convictions, aspirations, and pretensions of modern Western thought and culture since the Enlightenment. Postmodernism deals on how to make the term truth more absolute and more concrete. Now, here is one concern. Postmodernism is said to be not philosophy, but why? It is said that postmodernism is at best a holding pattern, perhaps cry of despair. It rightly talks about world philosophy, the philosophy of many cultures, but such talk is not a philosophy either. American philosopher Richard Rorty focused on developing themes from pragmatism and certain quarters of analytic philosophy and bringing this together with continental themes, challenged the modern rationalist presumption that philosophy or any branch of knowledge can find secure foundations or achieve genuine representation of reality. To understand more about the study of Rorty, let's define pragmatism. Pragmatism is the philosophy of considering practical consequences or real effects to be vital components of both meaning and truths. Postmodernists believe that humanity should come at truth beyond that rational to the non-rational elements of human nature, including the spiritual. They adhere to a relational, holistic approach, and they value our existence in the world and in our relation to it. To give postmodernism a lighter perspective, let's go to analytic tradition. For philosophers, language cannot describe objectively the truth. Analytic philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein clearly stated that language is socially conditioned. For Wittgenstein, language signifies as a medium to express truth. Now, let's look at analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is the conviction that to some significant degree, philosophical problems, puzzles, and errors are rooted in language and can be solved or avoided by a sound understanding of language and careful attention to its workings. To make it simpler, let's define analysis. Analysis refers to a method owing a great deal to the pioneers. And now, let's see the other analytic philosophers. We have Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and J.L. Austin. And for the final method of philosophizing, let's discuss logic. Logic is centered in the analysis and construction of arguments. To understand more about logic, let's define critical thinking. Critical thinking distinguishes facts and opinions or personal feelings, also takes consideration against bias and prejudice. Logic is actually divided into two types of reasoning, namely inductive and deductive reasoning. The first one is inductive reasoning, wherein it is based in observations in order to make generalizations. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, draws conclusion from usually one broad judgment or definition and one more specific assertion, often an inference. For validity and soundness of an argument, it comes from a logical conclusion based on logically constructed premises, or in other words, deductive argument was considered valid. As for the strength of an argument, inductive arguments cannot prove if the premises are true, which also determine the truth of the conclusion. Now, let's discuss the statistical and predictive argument, which are the common patterns of inductive reasoning. It is stated that the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily from the premises. And now, let's answer the following questions according to the lesson that we have just discussed. For the next lesson, we are going to discuss everything about fallacies. And that's all for this video lesson. Thanks for learning, everyone. Again, this is MindFeed.